Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. My old doll wants me back. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Box. Mira Evans slammed the car door shut, her eyes scanning the old house that stood at the end of the gravel driveway. The air was thick with the damp chill of the forest, which seemed to creep over the property like a blanket of fog. Her childhood home hadn't changed much, yet it felt suffocating now, more a tomb than a house. She sighed, grabbing her suitcase and bracing herself for a weekend of sorting through her late mother's things. The task felt impossible, like sifting through the ruins of a life she hadn't been a part of for years. Inside, the house was still. Dust clung to every surface. Mira made her way to the attic, her mother's hidden world of forgotten belongings. The wooden stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed, each step pulling her deeper into the past. She fumbled with the attic door, forcing it open to reveal a space cluttered with boxes and furniture draped in white sheets. She pulled the first box toward her, coughing as the dust swirled up from it. After sifting through old photo albums and trinkets, she found it an old, weathered box she hadn't seen in decades. The faded handwriting on the top read, "Mira's Things." Her pulse quickened as she opened it, revealing an antique doll nestled in a bed of yellowed tissue paper. "Celia," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The doll looked exactly the same: porcelain skin, glassy blue eyes, and long blonde curls. Not a scratch, not a single mark of time. But something about it felt wrong. Mira shook her head, brushing the uneasy feeling aside. She gingerly placed Celia on a nearby shelf and continued digging through the box. By nightfall, she was exhausted, mentally and physically. She retreated to her childhood bedroom, the day's task accomplished. As she lay in bed, she heard it. A faint whisper, barely more than a breath. Mira sat up, heart racing. The house was silent, yet she felt something watching her. She shivered, glancing toward the attic. "It's nothing," she told herself. The next morning, she awoke with a start. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes fell on the foot of her bed. Celia was sitting there, staring straight at her. Chapter 2. Unwanted Memories. Mira stared at the doll. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her body was frozen in place. How had Celia ended up here? She distinctly remembered leaving the doll in the attic the night before. Shaking off the mounting dread, she forced herself to pick it up. "You must have fallen somehow," she muttered, trying to convince herself as she placed the doll in a chair by the window. Still, that sensation of being watched gnawed at her. Celia's glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she dressed and tried to settle into her day. The house felt colder than she remembered. Her childhood room, once a safe haven, now seemed to loom over her with an eerie stillness. The wallpaper had faded, but her old bed and the shelves cluttered with relics from her past remained untouched. She stood in the doorway, memories flickering like half-lit flames in her mind. She had loved this room, loved the comfort it once brought her, but now everything felt distant. Even her memories of Celia were murky, clouded by something she couldn't quite grasp. Mira rubbed her temples as the flashbacks began to seep in. She was young, maybe 6 or 7, sitting on the floor of this very room, playing with Celia. The doll had always been her favorite, despite her mother's growing unease. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Mira, I don't like doll. It's unnatural." Mira had never understood her mother's hatred for Celia. She'd felt drawn to the doll, as if Celia was her constant companion, her only true friend. But now, thinking back, she remembered something else. The doll had never seemed to be just a toy. It was like it had wanted her, craved her attention. Mira had felt watched even back then. At night, the house came alive with whispers, creaks, and groans. The sound of giggling, light, and childlike danced down the hallway, causing the hair on the back of Mira's neck to stand on end. The first time she heard it, she rushed to the door, expecting to see someone. But there was nothing, just the empty, dark hallway stretching out before her. Her dreams grew darker. She saw herself as a child, sitting with Celia, except in these dreams. Her younger self looked frightened, her small hands trembling as she clutched the doll. When she awoke, sweat clinging to her skin, she found Celia in the chair, turned slightly toward the bed, as if watching her sleep. Chapter 3: The Doll's Game. Mira couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, after waking yet again to find Celia sitting unnervingly close, she grabbed the doll with trembling hands. The glassy eyes seemed to taunt her, cold and unblinking. Without a second thought, Mira marched up the attic stairs, her breath shallow and quick. She shoved the doll back into the dusty box, slamming the attic door shut behind her. For the first time in days, she felt a sliver of relief. Celia was locked away out of sight, out of mind. But the peace didn't last. At lunch, she found Celia sitting at the dining table, as if waiting to be served. The doll's vacant stare sent a chill down Mira's spine. She swore she had locked it in the attic. Heart pounding, she rushed back upstairs. The box was still sealed tight, the attic door closed. Yet Celia had appeared again. This was impossible. The doll started appearing everywhere, on the couch, as she tried to watch TV in her car when she went for a drive to clear her head. Mira threw it in the trunk, only to find it sitting calmly in the passenger seat the next time she stopped. Whispers filled the air around her, faint at first, but then growing louder, unmistakable. "Mira, don't leave me." Mira's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The whispers were coming from the doll. Celia was speaking. She tried to talk to friends about it, hoping for some kind of comfort, but each conversation ended the same way. They offered hollow reassurances. "It's just grief," they said, "stress playing tricks on your mind." She wanted to scream at them, make them believe her, but they dismissed her as exhausted, maybe a little unhinged. Her sense of isolation grew, tightening around her like a vise. She began to see Celia in the reflections of mirrors, in windows, always lurking just out of sight. Sometimes it wasn't the doll at all, but her own face, twisted and wrong. She couldn't trust what was real anymore. Her neighbor, Mrs. Mabel, the old woman who had once babysat her as a child, came by one afternoon with grim eyes. "That doll, it's got something wicked in it, Mira. Your mother knew it. Get rid of it before it takes you too." Mira's skin crawled at the warning, but what shook her to her core was what she found that evening, an old drawing of herself and Celia, scrawled in crayon. But something was horribly wrong with it. Celia's eyes were red, and the doll's tiny hand gripped Mira's too tightly, almost like it was pulling her in. Mira's breath hitched. She had no memory of drawing this. Chapter 4: The Doll's Secret. Mira sat in front of her laptop, surrounded by old family documents spread across the table. Her mind raced, a storm of questions and fragments of memories that never quite fit. The drawing with the red-eyed Celia lingered in her thoughts, casting a shadow over everything she did. She needed answers, something to make sense of the madness. Her fingers moved frantically over the keyboard, diving deep into any records she could find about her family's past. The more she uncovered, the more a pattern began to emerge. Celia wasn't just a childhood toy. Mira found old photographs, their edges frayed and yellowed with time, and in each one, Celia appeared. First with her grandmother, as a young girl, then with her mother as a child. The doll had been passed down through generations, like some cursed heirloom. A knot formed in Mira's stomach as the realization set in. Celia had been haunting her family for decades. She stumbled upon a journal entry written by her grandmother. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Celia was never just a doll. She was once a little girl, tragically taken too soon. But her spirit remains in that porcelain shell. She's possessive and she's dangerous. My mother tried to destroy her once, but Celia always came back. I fear she wants to keep her playmates forever. I won't let her have my daughter. Mira's breath hitched. Her mother had tried to protect her, just as her grandmother had. That's why her mother had kept Celia hidden, locked away in the attic, hoping to break the cycle. But it hadn't worked. The doll had found Mira again. The whispers became louder, more insistent now. They were no longer faint sounds carried by the wind. It was a child's voice, clear and unsettling. Don't leave me, Mira. We're not done playing. She slammed the laptop shut and rushed upstairs. This has to stop. She grabbed the doll from its spot by the window, where it had mysteriously returned. Its cold porcelain body felt heavier, as if resisting her touch. She took it to the backyard, determined to end this nightmare once and for all. Mira smashed Celia against a rock, over and over, until cracks formed across the doll's face. For a moment, she stood over the broken pieces, panting, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Relief washed over her. But when she returned to her room, her blood ran cold. There, on her bed, sat Celia. The cracks in her porcelain face had fused into a smile, an unnerving, sinister grin that hadn't been there before. Chapter 5. Descent in Madness. Mira's breath was shallow, her eyes fixed on Celia, now sitting on the bed with that cracked, twisted smile. It was impossible. This was impossible. Her legs felt weak beneath her as she backed away, but no matter how far she moved, she could feel Celia's gaze on her. Watching, always watching. Days blurred together. Mira isolated herself in the house, the walls closing in like the tightening grip of a vice. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the silence was suffocating. Every shadow stretched longer than it should. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps that never arrived. She started keeping the curtains closed, as if the outside world had become a distant memory. Her phone buzzed constantly with concerned messages from friends and work, but she ignored them all. She had bigger problems now. Celia's presence consumed everything. The doll appeared in different rooms, perched on chairs or shelves, always waiting for her, its smile widening with each passing day. Mira's thoughts spiraled. Was this real? It had to be. But part of her was terrified that her mind was cracking under the weight of grief and fear. Please, Mira whispered, her voice breaking as she faced Celia. What do you want from me? No answer. But the whispers never stopped. She heard them in the walls, in the wind outside the windows, in her own mind. Don't leave me, Mira. You can't leave. She wanted to run, to leave the house and never return. She packed a bag more than once, her hands trembling as she shoved clothes and essentials inside. But every time she touched the doorknob, something stopped her. A memory would surface, her younger self, playing with Celia, laughing. Or she'd hear a voice, faint but familiar, her mother's voice, warning her to stay away from the doll, to leave the house before it was too late. But she couldn't. Something held her here. Celia held her here. The house seemed to reflect her disintegrating mind. Cracks crawled up the walls, lights flickered ominously, and doors that she closed always crept open again. The place felt alive, like it was breathing her despair, feeding off her fear. In a fit of desperation, Mira grabbed Celia, marched to the fireplace, and threw the doll into the flames. The fire roared to life, and for a split second, Mira felt free. Then, a piercing child's scream echoed through the room, freezing her in place. When she turned back, the doll wasn't in the fire. It was sitting on the mantel, untouched. The crack in its face now looked like it was laughing at her. Chapter 6: The Doll's Control. Mira woke to darkness. Her head throbbed, her body sore, as if she'd been dragged across the floor. Blinking, she tried to make sense of her surroundings, the thick, musty air heavy with the stench of smoke and decay. She was lying on the living room floor, cold sweat soaking her clothes. The fireplace was still warm, the embers faintly glowing. But there was something else. Celia. The doll sat on the mantel, its cracked face turned toward her, eyes gleaming in the faint light. Mira's heart raced, and for the first time in days, the terror swelled into full-blown panic. The doll had won. She could feel it now, creeping inside her, tightening its grip on her mind and soul. But it wasn't just in her head anymore. A sharp pain shot through her wrist. She gasped and looked down. Red, angry scratches marred her skin, deep gouges that hadn't been there a moment ago. Her heart thudded faster as she noticed bruises, dark and swollen, forming around her arms as if something invisible had been holding her down. Celia's whispers curled through the air, sweet and sickening. "You're mine," the doll said. "We'll be together forever." Mira clutched her arms, trying to stop the tremors racking her body. She couldn't take it anymore. She needed help anyone. Desperation led her to pick up her phone. With shaky hands, she dialed the number she had found online, Eli, the paranormal investigator. Ellie arrived hours later, skeptical but curious, just as Mira expected. At first, he dismissed everything as stress or hallucinations. But then, the doll began to move. It was subtle at first, a faint shuffle of porcelain across the mantel. But soon, objects in the room shifted. A chair scraped across the floor. A lamp flickered violently. And then, the whispering began again, louder, clearer. "You're mine. You can't leave me." Ellie froze, his eyes wide. This isn't right. He set up his equipment and began to scan the room, muttering under his breath. "This is bad," he said. "I think the doll's possessed by a vengeful spirit, something tied to your family's past. It's feeding off your unresolved trauma." Mira felt the air thicken around her, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her chest. She had no time to think. Eli suggested a cleansing ritual, something to sever the doll's hold on her once and for all. He gathered candles, incense, and a strange book of rituals, the pages worn and fragile. As the ritual began, the house groaned, as if it was being torn apart from the inside. The walls shook, the lights flickered violently, and Mira collapsed. Her vision went black, and she was plunged into memories, her younger self, crying in a dark room, clutching Celia. She was trapped, suffocating in the doll's cold embrace. When she came to, it was over. But the doll wasn't on the mantel anymore. It was in her arms, its porcelain face twisted into a wicked smile. And a child's voice, soft and final, whispered in her ear, "I told you, you're mine." Chapter 7: The Past Unburied. Mira's eyes darted around the room, her pulse hammering in her throat. The doll, Celia, stood in the hallway, its porcelain face warped into that twisted, knowing smile. She could feel the weight of its gaze on her, its possessiveness, its cold demand. It was as if the doll had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to break. She backed away, but her body was shaking. The door was still slammed shut, as though something unseen had sealed it tight, locking her in. The house felt like a cage, closing in with every passing second. Mira's hands trembled as she stumbled to the old wooden bookshelf by the fireplace, the dust heavy on the pages of forgotten family journals and letters. She needed answers, something to explain the nightmare she was living, and the only place left to find them was in the past. She pulled out an old leather-bound journal, the cover cracked and worn. As she flipped through the brittle pages, her heart raced. Her mother's handwriting stared back at her, scrawled in a hurried, almost panicked script. The words were fragmented, but the meaning was clear. Mira had always known her mother had been afraid of the doll. She had tried to bury that memory, the strange tension in her mother's voice whenever Celia came up in conversation. But reading the journal, it hit her like a wave. Her mother had tried to get rid of the doll once before, years ago, but young Mira had begged her to keep it. The doll had been a comfort, something she clung to through the chaos of her childhood. But it was never just a comfort, was it? The journal entry that followed chilled her to the bone. Her mother had written about the doll's possession of Mira, how Celia seemed to drain the life from her, pulling the joy and warmth from her child. The letter, which Mira had never seen before, had never been sent. In it, her mother wrote about her fear that something terrible had happened when Mira was young, something she couldn't quite bring herself to explain. Mira's stomach twisted. Could the doll's grip have led to her mother's decline? Was it this cursed possession that had caused her to wither, to die so young? It made sense. Mira had been too young to understand it at the time, but now, with the doll in her hands again, the connection was undeniable. She was trapped. The doll had never let her mother go, and now it wouldn't let her go either. Mira turned, but before she could reach the door, it slammed shut. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw Celia in the hallway, its arms outstretched, beckoning her forward. "You're mine," the doll whispered, its voice cold and final. There was no escape. Chapter 8. The Final Game. The air in the house was thick with dread, suffocating her with every breath. Mira's chest ached, her mind scrambling for answers, as the walls around her seemed to pulse and shift, as though the very house itself were alive. The floor groaned beneath her feet, and the lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that slithered across the walls. The doll Celia was no longer just a presence in the room. It was everything. Its eyes were dark and knowing, filled with something primal, something that reached deep into the core of her being. She could feel its power now, not just in the scratches and bruises, but in the way it had crept into her every thought, every nightmare. The house had become a trap, the walls closing in, tightening around her like a noose. The doll wasn't just a cursed object. It was a manifestation of everything Mira had buried, her guilt, her shame, the memories of a childhood lost to fear and abandonment. "You're mine," the doll whispered again, its voice now a chorus of echoes in her head, merging with the memories of her younger self. "You can't escape me." Mira stumbled back, feeling the weight of those words. The truth crashed into her. This wasn't just a doll. It was her. It was a part of her broken childhood, the fears she had never let go of. Celia had always been with her, lurking in the shadows of her past, feeding on the darkest corners of her soul. To defeat it, Mira had to confront the truth. She had to face her childhood self, the scared, lonely little girl who had clung to the doll, who had begged her mother to keep it. The guilt over her mother's death, the memories of neglect, all the emotions she had buried had brought this nightmare to life. With trembling hands, Mira reached for the doll. "You're not real," she whispered through clenched teeth, her voice trembling with defiance. "You don't control me anymore." But the house roared. The walls cracked and split, as if the very foundation were tearing apart. The lights went out, plunging her into darkness. Mira's vision blurred, and she saw herself, a younger version of herself, standing beside Celia, the doll's cold porcelain fingers wrapped tightly around her tiny hand. The young girl was crying. The memories swirled, the trauma crashing over her like a tidal wave, drowning her in fear. But she fought. She cried out to her younger self, to the frightened girl who'd been trapped in the doll's grip. "Let go," Mira pleaded. "Let go of me." With a violent wrench, Mira ripped the doll from the air, hurling it across the room. The house shook, and in a final desperate act, she smashed it against the fireplace. Shards of porcelain flew, and the room fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. Mira stood, breathing heavily, staring at the broken pieces of Celia. But as she walked away, the house seemed to exhale a quiet, mournful sigh. From the upstairs window, a figure stood in the shadows, its silhouette impossibly clear against the dim light. Mira froze, her heart racing again. The doll wasn't gone. It would never be gone. As she turned to leave, the voice followed her, soft and chilling. "I'll be waiting." Mira didn't look back. She couldn't.